lot more this time around about the Catholic school system, the whole, because it is really quite different than how it proceeds in the U.S. And so it's been really fascinating to learn about the role of the RECs and what your incredible, very wide-ranging work is and how critical you are in the mission of the church in Australia. So that's very exciting. Basically, what I have done as I was meditating this morning, I changed what I was about to do for you somewhat. This will happen at the end of today's presentation. I added a section that I thought would be very critical for you to have, but it's not in your notes. When I get there, I'll let you know, okay? And so some of the things in your notes I will not actually cover. That will be at the end also. But you're free to take them and use them, but it's just going to be a little bit of a change because it seemed really relevant for you. Obviously, this is a relatively short amount of time. When we do Making Disciples, the original Making Disciples in the United States, it's a 4-day residential experience. And so what I'm giving you is just a taste of the most critical things that I thought would be most helpful to you in your work. Now, and of course adapted, obviously, for the Australian scene. We live in a world, and I'm sure this is really obvious to you, it is increasingly obvious to us in the United States, where religious identity is highly, highly fluid, and where the culture actually penalizes groups that depend upon inherited religious identity. And it doesn't matter what identity. I mean, in other words, it's just as true if the religion we're talking about is Islam or Judaism or, various forms of Christianity. But typically, our culture encourages people, even if you're raised in a faith tradition, to choose one, to reevaluate as a young adult and choose one for yourself, or choose none. So it can go that way. They can say, I was raised in a faith tradition, but I'm leaving that. Or, what's fascinating, they can be raised without any faith at all, and in the United States, the majority of children raised without a faith will choose one as a young adult. So the wind blows in both directions. It's basically, what's common is the sense that I do not inherit faith, I choose it. And that's what we're seeing across the board. So that means that groups that actively evangelize the culture, in a sense, helps them, and those that have historically depended upon inherited religious identity are basically at a disadvantage. So, you can see in 2010, 27 million people moved in and out of Christianity around the globe in 1 year. So larger than the entire population of Australia. And that's just to give you an idea. This is what normal looks like now in the 21st century. Now this, of course, just came out in April of 2014. I'm sure you probably may have heard about it. There was a very significant drop in Australians who identify as Christian just in 2 years. Okay, between 2011 and 2013. When this study came out in April, they said that by the fourth quarter of 2014, that if this trend did not change, that Christians would be a statistical minority in Australia. And here we are in the fourth quarter. I don't know if that's happened or not, but that's right on the cusp. That's what's going on. Now, these are people who've become unaffiliated, or what they call nuns. That is not primarily, it's not really about do you believe in God. It's about, are you part of any religious tradition? Or, do you self-identify with any religious tradition? This was a very striking, challenging statement from a study that was done at the behest of the the Australian bishops. They said only an unprecedented surge in attendance among people who do not currently attend Mass, or an unanticipated arrival, spelling mistake there, arrival of long numbers of Catholics from non-English speaking countries could affect the inevitable effects of advancing age. And urgent action is required if we are to save the treasure that is the Australian Catholic parish. Do you have the expression canary in a coal mine? We do in the US. The idea is in the old, when the coal miners, long before technology, the way they could tell if the gases were deadly for human beings is they would put a canary in a cage down in the mine, and if the canary died, it meant everybody get out. The parish is the canary in the coal mine. The parish most accurately reflects the vibrancy of the Catholic community as a whole. If the parish dies, the Catholic school system will be there soon after. There is no way for the Catholic school system to survive without the Catholic community. Not even as a service. It will cease to be Catholic in a generation or two, even as an outstanding service provider. So what we're really talking about is the future of the whole Catholic community, the whole Catholic thing in Australia, at all levels. And that's what's at stake in your work. And I want you to hear how critical your role is here. Because you are the evangelizers and the formators of the next generation, and several generations. And your role is hugely, hugely important at this moment. I know you've all seen this. About 12.2% of Catholics are at Mass on a given Sunday. About 15% are there overall, once a month. Which is very interesting because it's quite different than figures in the US. We have a lot more casual attendees than you do. What's really interesting to me is so many of your attending, your practicing Catholics, they consider them to be leaders. 44%, that's a huge percentage. Which tells me that the people who come are exceptionally committed. That percentage is much, much lower in the United States. So it's really, really interesting. Now, Parramatta is ahead of the curve nationally. You have the second highest attendance in the country. There's a lot of really interesting factors. You have a younger population, Catholic population overall. You have a gender balance that reflects the national norm more closely. You have lots, as I know you all know, lots and lots of immigrants from non-English speaking countries, who do tend to attend Mass on a regular basis, so they tend to be practicing. And you actually have a significant number of priests, of seminarians that are growing. So there's a lot of positive things happening here. That means you're in a better position than most Australian dioceses to really change the course of the church here in this area. I wanted to share this. This is not in the book. In fact, a lot of what I'm going to share today is not in the book because we've learned a lot in the last 3 years since I turned that manuscript in, and I want to share with you what we're learning. But this study came out in 2012. It's a Canadian study. It was fascinating. It's called Hemorrhaging Faith, so you can sort of get the gist from the title. But there was positive news in it, and that's what I want to share with you. They looked at children who were raised in mainline Protestant, evangelical Protestant, and Catholic backgrounds. And the question was, where are they as young adults? Are they still practicing? Are they gone? Have they become unaffiliated? Have they become nuns? There were 4 factors that they identified on a consistent basis for young adults who stayed practicing as young adults. The first was, had they had an experience of God, a personal experience of God, and had they seen answered prayer? This is very, very, postmodern people are not particularly moved by abstractions, generally speaking. They trust personal experience. So the experience of God and answered prayer was very important. A chance to talk about their own issues inside the Christian community was very significant. They didn't have to go somewhere else. They could talk about it here. They had a chance to wrestle with the core gospel story, which of course is the incarnation of God becoming human in Jesus of Nazareth, and his life and his teachings and his miracles and his relationships and his suffering and his death, his resurrection, his ascension, that great drama which is the center of our faith. They had a chance to wrestle with that as a whole story, wrestle with what it meant for them, for the people they cared about, for the world. You have to do that. If you don't have a chance to wrestle with that, you can't say yes. You cannot meaningfully follow someone to whom you've not yet been personally introduced. And so that was very key. And there were older adults around them, parents, other adults in their lives, perhaps teachers, people at the parish level, family, friends, whatever, extended family, older adults who were living authentic lives as disciples around them. If that was true, these 4 things were true, they were much more likely to be practicing, and if they were not true, they were gone. So notice, most of this is not theological in the sense that we typically think of it. There is the charismatic central, story that they have to wrestle with, but a lot of this is experiential and relational. And these were the key factors for young adults. It has been very interesting. In the United States, they did a massive survey in 2008 called the U.S. Religious Landscape Survey. 35,000 adults were interviewed all over the country. And one of the findings was really startling. It was that the majority of American Catholics were not certain they could have a personal relationship with God. 10% of Americans are former Catholics. Did you know that? It's staggering. Okay, we lost 32 million people and we didn't even notice. But those who still held to the identity, the majority were not certain you could have a personal relationship with God. This is what St. John Paul II was writing about in one of his early encyclicals, Catechesis in Our Time, when he said, the majority of Catholics are still without any explicit personal attachment to Jesus Christ. And in fact, in this context, he's actually talking about children. Especially children. They only have the capacity to believe placed within them by baptism and the presence of the Holy Spirit. When I first came across this, I thought, I was doing one of those things when I read people, and I suppose you probably have done that too. You read something and say, hey, you, author, come back here and explain yourself. We want to talk here. What do you mean by that? I was saying, all right, Holy Father, stop right now. Come here. I need to talk, all right? What do you mean by this? I have never seen anything like it before, and it took me years to uncover the theological premises behind this statement. But it does reflect church teaching. Baptism gives us the power to believe, but it does not give us personal faith. Those are 2 different things. Now, in our Making Disciples seminars, when we offer them, this is not in the book, it's a very simple schema we've used for years to help leaders at all levels grasp the idea that, of course, faith is not just showing up, it's not just being bodily present and fulfilling my obligation. It is, of course, a developmental, it's a growth process. So we talk about seeker, disciple, apostle. The seeker phase is the whole phase from maybe there isn't a God, or if there is a God, why should I care? Through that whole journey, and it really is a journey which you've been exploring when you've wrestled with the thresholds, that whole journey to, I am seeking deliberately to follow Jesus Christ as his disciple in the midst of his church. Now, both in the United States and I think pretty obviously here in Australia, the vast majority of Catholics are developmentally, existentially at this level, active or inactive. What was fascinating is to come across a study that said 25% of Australians do not believe in a God of any kind. Personal, impersonal, divine force, higher power, nothing. That was really striking. So a lot of Australians are at the far left-hand side of that spectrum. And it's important that we know this. I say this not to depress you, but if we're going to evangelize this generation, we have to know where they're starting. That's why the thresholds can be so incredibly valuable, so helpful in this process. This is the stage that I wrote the book about, because certainly it was true in the US, and then as the book has gone around the world, I've discovered increasingly it's true in most parts of the West as well, and even in Asia. I've been to Singapore and places like that. And basically anywhere that Western culture has reached, pretty much the same dynamics seem to be at work. And that is that we just simply haven't addressed the fact that most of our people developmentally in their real lived relationship with God are still back at the beginning. We presume because they were catechized and because they were sacramentalized that was taken care of automatically somehow. It's very true in the US. In practice, we presume this was in place. And it has been really stunning as the cultural support for practice has disappeared, the familial support has disappeared, and then what has been revealed is what was there at an actual lived level. And we're beginning to realize this was never addressed for most of us. There are many exceptions, but generally speaking. One of the other things we discovered as we worked with, we had about 1,600 parish and diocesan leaders from 60 dioceses go through making disciples before I wrote the book. And one of the things we discovered is that many of our leaders, even pastors, diocesan staff, had no category for disciple. They literally didn't know what we were talking about. It was really fascinating as we worked with all these people and listened to them. We realized that many, many Catholics, they had two categories. They had saint and they had normal. Now, are there any priests or religious here? Because if you are, you're definitely on the same track, automatically, by definition. Okay? Any deacons? Nobody. I guess we're all normal here. This is very odd. I don't know. Unnerving. But the rest of us are normal. Lay people are normal. And normal, the rules for normal were different from the rules for honorary, definite saint. Okay? And typically, for most of us who are just, grew up as Catholics, we're not uber active, but we do come to Mass, and we just grew up in that ethos and that culture. Normal meant you don't talk about it, okay, but you do. You don't talk, you do. You show up, you obey the rules, you come to Mass, you fulfill your obligations, etc. You try not to do anything dramatically bad. Or if you do, you go to confession. And, and that was normal. Normal people, it's interesting, normal Catholics often, very seldom, in terms of this traditional culture, ever talk to one another about their lived relationship with God. It's part of this sort of de facto culture of silence. Did anybody set out to create this? Of course not. This is not intentional on anybody's part. And of course, there's a big gap between our theology. We have a gorgeous theology of evangelization, and then there's our actual practice at the local level. So one of the things we've learned, we had to give people a biblical image for what it meant to be a disciple. That is somebody who's not yet a saint, but who has begun the journey of discipleship that ultimately will lead to sanctity. And so we use this image of dropping your nets. Peter and Andrew on the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus meets them and says, "Come, follow me." And it says, they were fishing. They had their nets in their hands, and the scripture says they left their nets and they followed him. This became really important because we did run into leaders in the U.S. who really believed this was mostly done in your sleep. No, seriously, one of my friends said he was getting trained as a master catechist, and he was seriously said, he was taught officially, they said, this is how it works. One morning you wake up and you're different. I've been trying that with weight loss. I am waiting, one morning I'm waking up and I've lost 20 pounds. So far, it just isn't happening. I don't know what is wrong with this picture. Or, it'd be really blissful. One morning I wake up and I'm in Australia. And I did not have to get on that plane. And that didn't work out either. I don't know. He couldn't swing that one. So, we know. How did you get here, right? How did you become a teacher? How did you get your job? How do you show up at class in the morning? Obviously, as adults, nothing in our life works like this. And yet, it is fascinating. Over and over again, we found people, when we talk about faith, it's talked about in almost magical terms. Basically, God zaps you, or, I don't know, but it doesn't involve you at any level, really, doing anything intentional. So, that's when we started talking about intentional disciples, and it was so fascinating. We started using that language out of desperation, mostly. There was no plan, trust me, there was no plan to this. People thought it's funny, people sometimes said, well, you were trying to come up with a trademark. I'm like, really? No. I got really tired of talking about discipleship and the church's teaching and having eyes glaze over is what happened. So I thought, well, maybe if we just say intentional, it'll be a little bit clearer. And I'll tell you it was clearer because people really snapped too. Of course, they got really angry about it, but they were awake. And that's always the first thing. I had no clues. To me, intentional disciples sounded like vanilla ice cream. Milk and cookies or biscuits or whatever. Tea and biscuits. It was so bland, so basic. Until we started using it in Catholic circles, and people all over the spectrum just said, what do you mean by intentional? And what was interesting, what they heard was, of course, judgmental, elitist, who basically died and made you queen of the universe, and said you had a right to look into people's souls and say where they are, all this sort of stuff. It was fascinating. I'm like, really? Is that what you think it's about? But it is, our the church's teaching in this area has always, I did not grow up as a Catholic. And one of the big differences between the evangelical world I come from and the Catholic world is that we actually believe we participate in the salvation process. Not that we earn our salvation or anything like that. It wasn't like I was taught. I was taught Catholics are all earning their salvation. They're working their way into heaven. Of course, that's not true. That's not what the church teaches. But we do have to say, we have to cooperate with grace at some level. Augustine said, God will not save us without us. That is our theology, has always been our theology, and yet in practice, sometimes we operate as though God saves us without us. And yet we know in every other aspect of our life that isn't how it works. If you don't show up in your classroom, the class will not go on without you. So, the idea of dropping your nets. Are you a saint? Do you know what you're doing? Of course not. Do you really understand what this is going to mean long term? Heavens no. But have you encountered Christ? Is he compelling enough for him when he says, come follow me, you say, yes. Even though I'm not certain what it means. It's two phrases in Latin that get translated into English with the same word, typically, of faith. But they do mean different things. One is the power to believe, which is the virtue of faith, the capacity to believe, and the other is that personal, intentional act of faith. When you read a church document that seems to say that baptism confers faith, what they mean is it confers the virtue of faith. What you and I as evangelizers are doing is calling people who have already received the capacity for faith to the act, the personal act of faith. That's what we're asking of them. That's what's going on here. I won't go into this in great detail, but I like to show this, especially to clergy. When I first read this, I thought Billy Graham wrote it. That's, of course, showing my evangelical roots, naturally. But it was the language. It was like moving to initial faith and knowing that you're justified by God's grace and knowing yourself to be a sinner and trusting in the mercy of God and repenting and all that stuff. And I thought, oh, I know who wrote this. Except it turned out to be from the Council of Trent. It is 450 years old, and it is as Catholic as it gets. This is the description, the church's description, of what's supposed to be in place before an adult is baptized. In order for the baptism to bear the fruit it's supposed to bear. All those things, and I won't go over all of them. You can look at it later. Notice there's a lot of intentionality. I'm moving freely toward God. I believe. I know myself to be a sinner. I trust, I repent, and I enter into the obedience of faith. There's a lot of intentionality described there. Somebody who's done all this is a disciple. Now, in the United States, we've had traditionally hundreds of thousands of adults enter the church every year for quite a while. And I realize that's unusual in the world, but it's been true where we are. However, 70% of those adults, I am one of them. I'm the survivor of 3 RCIAs and a graduate of none. They let me in anyway. That's a long story. We won't talk about it. But only 70% of those adults who went through RCIA and were received at Easter are not in Mass on Sunday. We help them change their religious identity, often for marriage or family reasons, right? But we did not call them to discipleship. Some of them never return to Mass after Easter. They're gone within a week. RCA is a phenomenal, stunning evangelization opportunity. I dreamed of RCA before I even knew it existed. As a Protestant, I dreamed of something like that. And when I found out Catholics did it, I was like, oh, amazing. That is until I actually went. Good times. The potential is phenomenal. The evangelizing potential is stunning. Just like the evangelizing potential in your schools is stunning. But how can we realize the potential? That's the question. In our parishes and probably in a lot of our schools, we've discovered there is people who are disciples often in Catholic communities suppress the expression of their discipleship because they're intimidated by the reactions of other people in the community. There's what we call the don't ask, don't tell culture. The deal is, we just won't go there. We'll talk institutional stuff all day long. Politics, administration, who's doing what, who's doing whom, who's the debates, all the personalities. But we will not talk about lived relationship with God. And what it means is that many times the disciples in our midst hide. They're here, but we don't know about it. when the culture begins to change, when we start to evangelize and the culture changes, what is interesting, many communities discover their disciples they don't know about because they were in hiding in our midst. One of my friends said, he said, in my parish, he said, they're coming out of the shadows. So it's been, these are things none of us knew. These are things we're just learning as we work with a whole network of evangelizers who are working in parishes and dioceses all over the United States and now increasingly other parts of the world. And we're seeing this right in front of our eyes. It's really been an amazing journey. Many, many people do not know, many Catholics do not know it is possible to have that relationship with God. I was at a major national evangelization conference in the US about a year ago. Invitation only. If I name some of the people there, you would know who they were. These are some of these people are famous. I was like going, what am I doing here at the same table with, you know, these people, bishops and stuff like that. And one man, and there's 120 people, came up to me 2 hours in and said, until I read your book, I did not know it was possible to have a personal relationship with God. He was in full-time ministry forming clergy. And I said, just tell me more, just help me understand, you know, because I thought, wow, what do I say now? He says, well, he came from a very good, practicing, serious, faithful Catholic family. He himself was practicing, and obviously very committed, or he wouldn't be doing what he was doing. Good guy. This is a good guy. He just said, we never talked about it. I just didn't know. Literally. He was in his 50s in full-time ministry, and he didn't know. And I've gotten that from people now all over the world. They come up one at a time and said, I do not know. Once you do know, once you've dropped your net, that's the disciple phase. This is where catechesis really comes into its own right at the later stages of seeking, you know, those last stages as you're just before you drop your nets, and early discipleship. Catechesis is really critical here. Now we're giving people what they're hungry for. We're answering questions they really have. It's a whole other ballgame. Suddenly they'll just inhale. They just want it so badly. So it's really, really critical that we're forming and shaping them. If you see children coming to personal faith in your classrooms, how do you support them in those very early stages? How do you form them? Because children can do this too. Children as young as 4 or 5, 9, 10 teens, all can make age-appropriate decisions to follow Jesus as a disciple. I did. I was 9. I know lots of people who did it much younger than that. And we've got our collaborators around the world are experimenting with this and seeing children at all ages respond. It is not something just for adults. Well, they have to grow in that, of course. I mean, my decision at 9 was a 9-year-old decision. It wasn't an adult decision. Did I have to revisit that as an adult as I grew, you know, and say yes again at a deeper and deeper level? Of course. But was it real? Sure. So it's entirely possible that we can seriously evangelize our children. When it comes to evangelization, we're discovering most Catholics will not go public with their faith in an indifferent or hostile environment until they are reasonably stable in their identity as a disciple. They've had some support, some sense of rootedness, some sense of growth, and that's when they gain the strength to go public. So in an environment like many places in this country, and of course in the US, like Seattle where I'm from, where there's a lot of public hostility to faith in the public arena, it takes a lot of strength to go public. Just around your colleagues, around your family, around your friends. So So the larger mission of evangelization really is dependent on the number of our people who reach this developmental stage. We've also seen that the gift discernment process, the called and gifted process, really helps as people recognize the ways they've been gifted by God for the sake of others. It helps them not only think of themselves as disciples, but to make that transition into, I am sent by Christ. I am following him, but I'm being sent by him. This is what, I am a missionary disciple, in Pope Francis's term, or an apostle. I am a sent one. I have a mission that's important. I'm answering the call of Christ. I've been called here, I've been gifted here, and I need to say another yes, another intentional yes, and answer that call. That is part, as Catholic educators, that is part of what we are doing, is facilitating an encounter which will enable every single baptized person to recognize and answer that call. The church teaches it is the responsibility of the church. Her mission is fulfilled when she enables every single baptized person to answer the vocational call they've been given. There is no such thing as vocational unemployment for Catholics. People often, sometimes in the gifts discernment, they come and they say, well, I have no gifts, and I'm like, are you baptized? It's too late. Sorry about that. Nobody asked you, I know, but seriously, it comes with baptism. And when we call a child, a teen, an adult, to say that personal yes, all these things begin to emerge in their lives. So that's part of what is at stake. Discipleship changes everything. Parishes that evangelize, schools that evangelize, all the stuff we want people to do. Come to Mass, pray, study, grow in their knowledge of their faith, discern personal call. They clamor to discern, serve, give. Evangelizing parishes tell me over and over again, we have the highest per capita giving in the diocese. It's gotten to the point where I just consider it a check mark. I said, yeah, oh really? Oh, how interesting. Okay. They pass on their faith to their children successfully. They take risks for the kingdom of God. They care about justice. And not out of guilt, but it wells up out of that lived relationship. And it has enormous implications for everything, including the future of the Catholic school system and stewardship in the parish, just vocations at all levels, and not just priestly and religious vocations, but secular vocations. Vocations to be Catholic school teachers, for instance, or principals, or RECs, or to be in politics, or to be in the arts, or called to science, or called to, family life. So the apostle stage, I am now discerning my personal call, and I have discerned it, I'm living it with the support of the Christian community. This is the stage at which evangelization of individuals in the larger culture occurs. This is the stage at which personal vocation is discerned. This is the stage at which the evangelization, the whole issue of social justice, the application of the church's teaching in the larger culture occurs. Because that requires, it's a very sophisticated task, requiring lay apostles with a profound rootedness as being disciples. My estimate, based on our experience, we've worked with 100,000 people now in 130 dioceses, and at least 500 parishes. I'm sure it's well beyond that now, but I've lost track. Our experience so far, my guess, is that only about 1% right now of our people reach this level of spiritual development. It doesn't take long in an environment that really actively fosters this growth. People can get here in a year or two. They can go from dropping their nets to apostle in a year or two. It is not rocket science. They're not saints yet. We're not talking, mystical union with God, that sort of thing. It's not really difficult to do. But you do have to do it intentionally and together. And again, I think your role could be hugely important in this area. One last thing here. Parishes also have communal norms. Not only do individuals make this journey, but parishes do too, as a community. And schools, Catholic schools, can make this journey too, as a community. In our experience to date, the average parish culture, spiritual norm of an average parish, an average, just not associated with any specialized movement, just standard diocesan, middle of the road parish. The norm, the spiritual norm that we have accepted as normal is at trust. It's at the very earliest and most passive level of spiritual development. That has huge implications. Now, there are many disciples often embedded in that overall culture, but many of them are failing to thrive because it's very hard to thrive by yourself when the norm does not when there's no category for who you are, basically. When your spiritual experience is so far beyond the cultural norm of the community. The average evangelical congregation, I would say in the U.S., my knowledge isn't deep enough to know about everywhere in the world, but certainly in the U.S., the average norm would be an early discipleship. It is not because they are saints, believe me. I know them very well. It's not because they're smarter or God loves them more or anything like that. It's just they know this preliminary conversation has to happen. They know they have to call people to say that initial yes. In the U.S., half of Catholics who leave the church go end up in the Protestant world. They're the half whose faith is not declining, it's growing. And they felt they couldn't get help in the parish, and so they go where they can get help. And because evangelical churches happen to know how to hold this conversation, that's where they end up. Now, there is absolutely no reason. We know Catholic parishes that are far, far beyond that. Like the one I write about in the book, Praise the King. They had 30, as you know, it's a community, by U.S. standards, it's a relatively small community, 900 families. They have already 30 ordained priests, including a bishop. They had 20 guys in seminary when I interviewed them 3 years ago. And now I know that the grade 12 students that I interviewed are now in seminary, right? They were talking about it, now they're there. They had their homegrown sisters, homegrown brothers, homegrown lay apostles. I mean, amazing people doing amazing things. Most of the social justice initiatives in the area stem from members of that parish. But the story, it was fascinating. They were very serious about the evangelization of their children. The pastor said when our first graders, in this case I guess they were giving first communion to, they were about age 6 or 7, he said they're so excited when they're about to receive first communion. He says they're just dancing around, He said our middle schoolers, I know you don't have middle schools, but we're talking 6, 7, 8. He says we have a camp for girls and boys, and our goal for that camp is to give our kids as big an experience of God as we possibly can. And then they had a whole retreat system for the older, for the secondary students. All the way through, they were constantly and very intentionally evangelizing their children. They had tremendous family support. I mean, the parents were disciples. It's 98% mass attendance at this congregation. And that's what happens. And so the children saw it modeled by the adults. They were constantly given opportunities to experience God, to see answered prayer, all the things we talked about. And most of them become disciples. I mean, it's just, they say yes at some point. Our parishes could be there. There's nothing about being Catholic that says we could not do the same, with all the fruits that come from it. And our schools could have cultures that intentionally foster discipleship at all ages, or at least set the stage for it. Help children deliberately move into trust. And we all have institutional constraints. Because, Catholics are famously the big battalion people. And we are institution makers and creators. We've got this incredible network of institutions, schools, hospitals, clinics, orphanages, parishes, dioceses, And so how do we help the institutions serve the end for which they were created? The Catholic school system was created to evangelize. I mean, the history is fascinating. Evangelization is at the essential DNA of the Catholic school system. So how do we help all of our institutions, whatever they happen to be, to serve the end for which we exist? Now, I realized, I was asking, should I skip the thresholds altogether? And they said, well, not everybody had been part of that conversation. So I am going to go over them quickly in order to set you up for a skill that I would like to leave you with this afternoon. That will be, you can use almost anywhere. It's incredibly versatile, highly transferable, and can make almost anything you do evangelizing. So we'll get there. The thresholds. Here's the idea. There are multiple stages. There are pre-discipleship levels of spiritual development that are really works of the Holy Spirit, that are really works of grace, that all took spiritual energy to move into. I mean, someone said yes to move into each threshold. These are stages of deeper and deeper conversion. But they're not yet discipleship. And when I first came across this years ago, I was so excited because it named what almost every one of us knew that worked in this area. We knew that God was at work in people's lives, and yet we knew it was not yet discipleship. And I even went to my own pastor, who was, he built the parish. He's been there for over 30 years. He's the dean of the clergy. He knows everyone in the diocese. And he's been passionate about evangelism for 50 years, ever since he was ordained. And I asked him the question, what percentage of our parishioners would you estimate are intentional disciples? Now that's a question we've asked many, many leaders all over the world. And it was so funny. His response, he had no idea of our experience. He had no idea what this question meant. And he answered just like everybody else would ever. It was so funny. It's like there's a memo that went around and everybody got it. He said, wow. He says, well, what do you mean by intentional disciples? So I had that conversation. And then he said, He said, I've got a lot of good people, and they do a lot of good things, and they have some real spiritual questions, and I'd say 5%. He did not know that that is the question we've gotten year after year, event after event, group after group, and we've asked people from all over the world. Not that it's scientific, it does not make it a scientific guess, if you will, or estimate. It's not a study. But it does represent thousands of years of pastoral experience. So my question is, and he said exactly the same thing, what's fascinating. So what if it's even close enough for government work? What if it's single digit? What does that mean? That's why I have 5% of active, because that's what we keep hearing. And 5% have reached that point where they're deliberately seeking to follow Jesus Christ as his disciple. That would imply that 95% of active, practicing Catholics, because that's who we're talking about, right? Because if they're not here, my leaders couldn't begin to evaluate where they were in their relationship with God. They didn't know them. So this is about practicing Catholics, the ones who show up often enough so that we actually get to know them, at least a little. It would imply that the majority of our people are in the earlier stages somewhere of spiritual development. Trust, curiosity, openness, seeking, okay? So now this is lived relationship with God. It's independent whether you're baptized or unbaptized, because you could be baptized and have no trust at all. You can be unbaptized and be a disciple, and every possible variation. So, that white square represents every human being on the planet, all 7.3 billion of us. Jesus Christ is the mystical center of the cosmos, whether we ever heard of him or not, believe in him or not, know anything about him. But mystically, we believe as Catholics, he is the center. The question is, 1/3 of the human race is baptized almost exactly. And if that looks low, I should tell you that that is probably the highest percentage in human history, because the vast majority of the human race who have lived in the last 2,000 years never had an opportunity to be baptized. Scholars estimate that only about 36% of people who've lived in the last 2,000 years had an opportunity to be baptized, and about 24% actually were baptized. So to have 1/3 of the human race in that category is actually quite significant. So think of it, baptism is normative, but it isn't normal. Now, let's look at where people are in their lived relationship with God. There are many people who neither believe or trust, right? We have lots of them in the U.S. I think you've probably got lots of them here. Trust is that first threshold as they move closer to Christ, though they may not understand that that's who they're moving closer to. Trust, they can move closer into curiosity, openness, seeking, and intentional discipleship. Okay. We do not want to confuse those early stages, trust, curiosity, openness, with discipleship or this active personal faith, attachment to Jesus Christ that St. John Paul was talking about. This is not yet, those early stages are not yet that active personal active faith. They are earlier stages. In our experience, the majority of Catholics, practicing or non-practicing, are in one of these early stages. In fact, the norm, generally speaking, seems to be about trust. If there is no trust, they will not be physically present. So you can almost always assume is somebody not present in a Catholic school. That's a different issue. The dynamics are different. But if they're attending Mass, they probably have trust. They're probably at least there. Typically, if they have no trust, they will not physically be present. It's interesting that for various reasons, people who do not trust us are willing to send their children to Catholic schools. So, always remember, this is critical. A threshold looks really different from the inside than it does from the outside. What I mean is somebody who is approaching Christianity, Christ, even if they don't understand that's what they're doing, you have to understand it looks much scarier to them than it does to those of us who are on the inside. Because we're all saying, oh, come on, we're nice people here. Come join us, hey! And I speak from experience, I speak as somebody who came from the far end of the planet on a long journey to become Catholic. I was raised as an anti-Catholic, deeply anti-Catholic fundamentalist in southern Mississippi. And usually when I say that to Australians, other people say, yes, Mississippi, I know it has an interesting feel to it. I was with Clara the very first time I taught in Newcastle 15 years ago. I guess it was my first trip to Australia. The room, there was a gasp in the room when I mentioned that. It was this audible, you know. And you could see, everybody had big, big eyes. And I looked at them, I said, let me guess, you've all seen Gone with the Wind. They all said yes. And I'd say, you know, things have changed a little bit in the last 150 years of this, you know. But seriously, I mean, I lived 2 doors from St. Clair's Catholic Church, which I regarded as the anteroom of hell as a child. But that didn't question. We believed Catholic Church was the whore of Babylon, you know, the whole thing. Okay. that, we have the American tradition of Halloween, which I guess you don't celebrate here. You do? You're starting to? Okay. But you know how it works, right? The children go from door to door, and basically they extract candy from you. They manipulate, So in America, you put a light on, you put a pumpkin outside your door with a carved face and a candle in it. That's how you let people know you're open for business. And so the children come all night long, and they're ringing the doorbell, and they're all dressed up in their costumes and various personalities. And you open the door and you say, trick or treat. And then your job, of course, is to shovel out the goodies. Well, we thought we were out to go trick or treat, my brother and we were about 8 or 9. But there were sisters at the parish, and they had a light on and a pumpkin at the door, the universal sign for chocolate. And though normally we would have nothing to do with those Catholics because we knew this was demonic and we're into the law. But there comes a point where you don't want to be too dogmatic. Really. You want to be pragmatic, and chocolate is really the point at which you do that. So Catholic chocolate was as good as anybody else's. And so my brother and I, in an act of incredible daring, decided we were going to knock on the door of that sister's house. We went up there and it was like, ooh, waiting for them to open so we could say trick or treat. And the door didn't open. And then we heard a scream from above. And I looked up, and there was one of the sisters, and she was dressed all like a witch, all in black with a hat and everything. And she was cackling. And I looked at her, and I thought, it's all true. It's all true. Okay, please have mercy on your fundamentalist neighbors. That kept me out of the church for many years. So for me, think about it. For me to consider becoming a Catholic was like considering becoming a Martian. So my first RCA class, we did not have padded chairs, of course. We had the traditional gray, battered metal chair. You understand, the crooked one with the legs that are broken. Okay. So you sit down in the really grim parish hall, dim, dirty, broken chairs. You sit down. That was the norm. And I was the first person in the room. I had a big book with me called Catholicism. I picked it up at a bookstore because I figured they all came from the Vatican printing plant. I didn't know there was any controversy about anything. Because, everyone knows the Catholic Church is monolithic. And there are no debates among Catholics. You know that, right? So I had the big book, I put it in the chair, and I waited. And the first member of the RCA team showed up, took one look at the book, took one look at me. Without even introducing himself, he said, I see where you're coming from. I'm like, huh? I said, I don't even know where I'm coming from. I don't know where I'm coming from. That was my first clue that there's a whole lot to being Catholic that is not written in the catechism. And nobody tells you about it. He was projecting his insider knowledge categories on me without a clue in the world how profoundly different my understanding of the situation was. The same is true with all the thresholds. A threshold that seems so easy and obvious to us can seem like teetering on the edge of an abyss to someone coming from the outside. So we need to enter into their perspective as much as we possibly can. You and I are now ultimate insiders. We think and breathe this stuff all the time. And we're going to have to move imaginatively out in order to grasp what it may look like to somebody from the outside. Because unless we do so, we can cause people to freeze in place or even run for the hills, like the sisters did to me, unintentionally with the best will in the world. So, trust. This is not faith. This is some positive association with Christ, with Christianity, with the church. Or maybe I don't believe in trust any of that. but I know you. I like you. I think you're, well, crazy to take that religious stuff seriously. But you know, I like you anyway, and I trust you. You're my bridge. You're my living bridge of trust. There has to be a bridge of trust or people will not move any further. This is establishing that bridge of trust is the first act of evangelism. And especially in the postmodern world, this is so critical. Now, many people, there's all kinds of versions of trust. I've met people who don't trust. I met a woman who did not trust any member of the Trinity or the church, but she trusted the Virgin Mary. Now, you don't want to ask her, now, the Virgin Mary is the Virgin Mary because she's the mother of Jesus, whom you do not trust. It doesn't have to make theological sense. Okay? Some people trust the church as an institution. I mean, they don't trust God, they trust the church. I've met lots of other people who say, well, I don't trust the church, but I trust God. Every variation, but where is that bridge? It's got to be there. That's what we're looking for. Behold the great trust builder. It is really stunning. This study, unfortunately they didn't do Australians, I don't know why, but they looked at Brits, Canadians, and Americans. And they looked at lapsed or non-practicing Catholics. So people either former Catholics or just non-practicing. And they said, are you, basically they were trying to look at how did their understanding of Pope Francis, who of course none of them had met personally, it's all through the media, but what they thought they had heard through the media affect their understanding of the church and their openness to the possibility of coming back. And what was stunning is across the board in all those countries, it was different in different countries, a very significant percentage said, I am rethinking the possibility of coming back because of Pope Francis. And it was so funny, CNN, last week, just before I came here, did a video. It was a national news, they did an interview. They did actually a piece on that part of Michigan that I talk about in the book that has produced all these priests. There are 3 little towns. One of them was Christ the King, and one was dual little towns in Fowler, Westphalia, Michigan. And they went and visited it because it was this boom town for priests. And also because they had twin brothers who were being ordained, photogenic. But what was fascinating is I listened to a Catholic radio personality interviewing the reporter, the CNN reporter, who'd done the story. And at the end, he said, she was very impressed with these young priests, she was very, he said, so how did that make you feel, or how did that change your perspective on Catholicism? And her response was fascinating. She said, well, that didn't really, but your Pope, Pope Francis, he has. I heard stories the week he was elected. Seriously, one of the members on our Facebook forum, she said, we had a woman walk through the door this afternoon and say, I want to become Catholic. And he said, oh, fantastic, wonderful, why? I saw the Pope on television. But what if 250,000 lapsed Australian Catholics were rethinking? Now, it's only trust. This is just an initial bridge, but it's huge. But guess who gets to walk across the bridge that Pope Francis is helping to build? You and I, the person, the Catholic, the disciple on the spot, is the one who's going to help these people walk further, move beyond trust into something else, into curiosity, the next threshold. Now, this is casual curiosity, it is casual dating, it is not engagement, it is not marriage, it is not commitment, it's just, oh, you're interesting. It was so funny, I was in a flight coming into Manhattan, and for some reason the guy next to me decided to talk to me the last 15 minutes of the flight, and he was very, very, very New York. Do you know what I mean by that? And culture. You see enough, you must have seen lots of films in which they portray New Yorkers. So they're kind of very direct and very in your face, and they have that whole sort of energy. And he was very, very New York, and he was also very Jewish. And it was really interesting. So he turns to me and says, "So you, what do you do?" And I'm thinking, okay, how am I going to explain this? So I said, well, you know, I go around the world and I put on workshops that help people discern how they've been gifted by God for the sake of others. He goes, you're interesting. Of course, you know, my immediate thought was, do I want to be interesting? That, you know, they don't mean interesting, they mean weird. You know what I mean? It's not a good thing to be interesting. And I'm like, huh? He says, so, do you believe in this Jesus guy? Yeah. Oh, he says, you may have figured out I'm Jewish. I'm like, had figured that out, yes. He says, so, how much do you make on these workshops? Like, $25,000? I snorted. I couldn't help it. I said, I'm Catholic. He said, oh, too bad. He knew what that was. But you're interesting. That's curiosity. It's not a commitment. No one's signing on a dotted line anywhere. It's not faith yet, but it's really important as a transition phase. Curiosity, they could be curious about the idea of having a personal relationship with God. They may not, as many people in our culture, they don't know it's even possible. But you seem to act like it's possible. And they're going like, oh, whoa, there's a big idea. That's something I never even thought of. Interesting. That's interesting. I'll think about that for a while. So we want to foster curiosity primarily about Jesus, if we're going to make disciples. Not first and foremost about the church or about Catholicism as an ism. If we're making disciples, we want to foster curiosity primarily about the Lord, the head, the center, the foundation of the church, which is Jesus. And then all the rest will follow. Now, Jesus was a master. He was a great curiosity inducer. He hardly ever did Q&A. He always did Q and Q. Right? As soon as you ask the question, he returned a question. Why do you ask that of me? What do you want? What are you seeking? Who do you say that I am? You know, on and on. So he understood that. Our task at this threshold is not primarily catechetical. My instincts, I'm a teacher, my instincts are, I want to dump. Give me a small opening, and I want to dump. You know what I mean? You want to dump everything. Oh, there's an opening, man, now I can run with it because there's so much cool stuff here. I can just, shovel it in as fast as I can. And then I scare them away. I could extinguish their curiosity easily by giving them a gallon of answers. They had a teaspoonful of curiosity, and I drowned it. And I have done this. I whip out my theological dictionary, the Blessed Virgin Mary. By the time I'm done with them, they're sitting there going, I'll never ask another question as long as I live. So don't do what I do, okay? The stages of curiosity, it becomes more and more curious. At first it's just, I'm aware that there's things out there I never even dreamed of, like maybe having a relationship with God. And then I become more curious, and now I'm getting to know somebody who, is a Christian, and I'm reading things, I'm taking some initiative on my own, and then I start really grappling. When you get down to engagement, frankly, if we have people at that level of curiosity in RCA, it makes us nervous, because they're the ones who are asking like a lot of tough questions, and there's a lot of energy behind it. And we start to feel a little defensive, We prefer they be a little bit more passive about this. But actually, it's a really good sign, because it means they're moving into more and more curiosity, and that's what we want them to do. This is not the stage for confronting lifestyle issues, probably. Not yet. That will come. We want them primarily to focus on first things, which is Jesus himself, his life, his teachings, his miracles, the whole saga, his life, his death, his resurrection. That whole drama, this is what we want them to be intrigued by, drawn to. And there's two things that were very characteristic of Jesus' ministry during his lifetime that are very curiosity-inducing. One is healing, and the other is forgiving. And so that is our mission with somebody who's at this threshold. So I have one last question. We only have a few minutes. We have about 10 minutes here. How could you intentionally build curiosity about Jesus in the course of your work, in your students, in your faculty, other places in your life, other people that you're working with? God really took me up on that one. So openness is not discipleship. It's just a tentative, beginning openness to the possibility of change. And but it can just opening the door that crack. I mean, think about it. The level of, you have to drop your defenses and your cynicism and your antagonism and your fear enough, just enough, to say, okay, I'll open it 1%. But that can seem overwhelming. So this is a transition a lot of people struggle with and a lot of people don't make. They really need our help to make this transition. Now, and this is why intercessory prayer is really critical. They need our prayer because all the fears, anxieties inside that you and I are not aware that they have, they may not even be fully aware of why they're reacting the way they do. They don't know necessarily themselves. They maybe get opposition from other people who are aware that they're showing some interest, or they're on this journey. The enemy could, be involved as well. So there's many things that conspire to prevent somebody from crossing this threshold, and they need us to pray for them. And I just wanted to point this out. Have you heard of night fever? Okay, it came out of World Youth Day in Cologne. It's spreading over large parts of Europe. It's in London. It's now in the US in a few places, in Canada in a few places. What this is, the idea is in an urban environment, say like in Sydney, if you have a church downtown, you might you'd have Eucharistic adoration and you open the doors and you have people outside, usually young adults outside, who just talk to people who pass, and they have candles that they offer them, and they basically say, you want to come inside? Would you like to rest? Do you want to pray? We have music playing. There's somebody you can talk to. Someone who will pray for you. There's priests there to hear confessions. Or if you don't have any time and you have a prayer request, just tell us and we'll light a candle for you and pray for your prayer request. Well, it's fascinating. When I was doing clergy days in Denver in the spring, the night before, one of the priests had flown in from London. He'd been part of night fever in London the night before. He said 400 people walked into that church in the course of one evening in the middle of the West End Theater District, in one of the most secular places on earth. And it's just amazing. And it's really, what we're discovering is, just like for me, adoration, can touch people at these levels that go way beyond their knowledge. You don't have to know anything. You don't have to believe anything. You could be totally skeptical. You could be me walking across the threshold with a head full of anti-Catholic mush, and the Holy Spirit just goes, boom, and builds a bridge of trust, or raises curiosity, or helps you move into openness. So I'd just like to propose Eucharistic adoration. It's open to anybody. All you have to do is be able to sit down. You don't have to be catechized at all. You don't have to be Catholic. You don't have to be baptized. And yet you can have an encounter with the risen Christ. And so it's not just a devotion for the already devout. And so I just like to always pass that on. Now there's a couple of things that we're finding out that are kind of surprising for us. A lot of our people, like if we're putting them, if they're going through an evangelizing retreat, for instance, we've discovered many of them don't come out disciples after the first experience. Part of that is because there are, for many people, earlier issues they have to deal with first that we didn't actually know about. One of which is the big idea, I can have a personal relationship with God. That is a very widespread issue for a lot of cradle Catholics that they have to wrestle with first. Do I even want this? Much less am I going to be a disciple, but this whole idea. So they will spend most of the retreat not asking, will I follow Jesus as a disciple? They're still wrestling with, do I even want to go? Do I want to have a relationship with God? Is this even possible? That's one. And two, this is a little bit more complicated to describe. We're discovering many cradle Catholics, their only experience of prayer is the Mass. If that's true, then often their understanding of prayer, because it's based on their experience at Mass, is that it's totally scripted for them, and it's totally en masse, right? We do and say everything together. I mean, I'm not going to go dancing in the aisles during Mass while the rest of you are doing something else. I'm not going to stand up when everybody else is kneeling. And when it's time, we all say the same things together, we do the same gestures together at the same time, we all receive communion at the same time, I don't go up halfway through and say, all right, I'm ready. We don't do that. But think about what you learn if that is your only experience of prayer. What we're discovering is many Catholics, the idea that I'm going to step out of the crowd, stand before God as an individual and say a personal yes, is a whole new idea. Because my experience has been totally scripted and totally group, never individual. And so they have to wrestle with that possibility, and that hits a lot of people really hard. So what I'm trying to say is, generally speaking, for instance, if somebody goes through an Alpha course, because I guess some of you are familiar with that, it's being done here in Australia, there's a good chance they may come out in openness. They may come at the end of the course or the end of the retreat out at openness rather than intentional discipleship. That's a huge thing to do. I mean, because moving to this threshold is a big deal. It takes a lot of spiritual courage to do it. But we don't want to drop them. In practice, especially in the US, what we've typically done is we want people to go on a retreat, get excited about their faith, and then we want to put it to work, basically. That's often the way we operate. But we have to understand somebody could come out of one of these retreats at openness. They're already beyond the communal norm. The communal norm is back to trust. They're beyond that, and yet they're not yet disciples. You don't want to drop them. In other words, just say, okay, well, you're done. You went through the retreat. We're done. Now get to work. We need to plan, part of understanding the thresholds is I will have a sense of where you were at the beginning. I can watch your journey throughout the retreat. I have a sense of where you are when you finish. And we have thought through how to continue to walk with you, not to drop you or to abandon you, but to walk with you as you finish the rest of the journey. So that's what I'm saying. Think about this with your children. They too may be in this situation. If you're doing a high school level retreat, a secondary level retreat, or some experience for younger children, and you realize there's spiritual movement going on, that's fabulous. Yes, say, oh, praise God, I think it's wonderful, this is so exciting, but realize it's only the beginning of a larger journey. And we want to make sure they do not feel abandoned, as they move along. So, does that make sense? I'm looking very intent. Okay. So, now, past openness is what I call the zone. That is because when somebody moves beyond openness, they're moving from passive to active. Now they are seriously, actively grappling with the possibility, again, they have not made a commitment per se, but they are grappling with the possibility of dropping their nets. And that is very different territory. If you have a lot of people in your parish, in your school, who have reached seeking, the energy level, the spiritual energy level goes right through the roof, because now people are seriously grappling with the possibility of doing something very significant. Seeking is not openness. It's not yet discipleship either. It's not just being passively open to the universe or to change. Now, this is like serious dating. This is, are you the one dating? This is looking serious. Am I going to commit? That's what we're talking about. It feels like a quest. It feels like I need to say a yes or a no. I need to make a decision. I'm going to have to. And so it may not look that dramatic from our perspective looking on, but it feels dramatic for the person who's going through it. And they do have a sense. This is now something I need to make a decision about. And so it's really dating with a purpose. They do seek resolution one way or the other. You can't sustain this forever. I mean, it's just like, if you're seriously considering, getting engaged to somebody, you can't sustain that forever. You're going to say yes, or you're going to say no, eventually. So we want to be very aware of people who are grappling with this choice at this level. We want to model seeking after Christ in our own lives. Because, of course, just because you and I may be disciples doesn't mean you stop seeking. No, that was just the beginning of the journey, but of course we want to grow closer and closer, to Christ as we follow Him. They need to see that we too are still on a journey. Now we're on a journey as disciples, we're intensifying our discipleship, but that's part of it, but they see that that is normal. This is the level at which we often will help many people in the 21st century in the West wrestle with the idea of personal sin. Especially for young adults, it is not a concept that they have. Personal sin, we make mistakes. I need to grow, but I don't personally sin. And the idea that I personally, not just institutional sin, we're very aware of institutional sin. I'm aware of systems of sin out there, but I don't personally, seriously, deliberately do really bad things. I just make mistakes. And then I grow. But the idea that I have, in fact, really done seriously bad things that may have seriously hurt other people, for which I need to take some kind of responsibility. For many postmodern people, if we have managed to avoid the dramatic stuff, if we managed to avoid going to prison, and stuff at that level. Now, I have a friend who works with ex-cons and addicts in Houston, Texas, in the Bible Belt. She says, my people, they know they're sinners. She says, I don't have to convince them.